Hello, everyone. My name is Adol Korkor, and I'm the founder and the CEO of the A.B. Korkor Foundation for Mental Health. I welcome all of you to our first of four series of webinars addressing the mental health challenges during this pandemic and beyond. Uh, the A.B. Korkor Foundation has been around for about 4 years. Our flagship activity has been the 550/50. With the purpose of it is to raise awareness for the mental health challenges in our country, and reduce the stigma, and enforce the role of physical exercise in mental health. We did it in 2018. I ran all of them, and we had over 2,000 participants. And we did it again in 2019. We had over 3,000 participants. And however, this year, because of the pandemic, we're not able to do it. But we are doing it virtually, and we extended the time that people can actually participate until June 14. So if you really are willing to help us and support us on this on our mission, please go ahead and sign up by going online to the 55050.com website. Like I said, our mission is really to raise awareness and improve the stigma and enforce the role of physical exercise in mental health. And above and beyond that is really to provide a broader education of the understanding of the mental health crisis that we have in America and try to find solutions for it. Uh, so we decided that considering the pandemic and the impact that it has already pre-existing epidemic of mental health in America, we felt that providing this type of education webinars might be helpful to all of you. So please, I thank you for your participation. And let me provide you with some housekeeping issues. When you look at your screen, they would be on your right-hand side, that chat. So this will allow you to communicate with us if there's any technical issues, if you're unable to see us or hear us or whatever. We have our technical support in the background here. And on the bottom of the screen, you have question and answer. So you can ask any questions, and I will be reviewing those questions and provided them to the speakers. This four seminars are actually going to be starting today with Dr. Bartholomew. I will introduce him a bit later. On the 29th, we have Dr. John Lerman, the head of psychiatry at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He'll be talking about strategies to deal with depression, anxiety, and domestic violence. On June 1st, we're going to have Dr. Moser talking about strategies to deal with social isolation and despair, which is a huge challenge. And then finally, Dr. Wignall will be talking about resilience training and mindfulness in everyday life, which can help us now and into the future. Let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Dr. John Bartholomew, he is the professor, department chair of the Kinesiology and Health Education at the University of Texas in Austin. He's done extensive amount of research and publications related to exercise, physical activity, and that of overall wellness, and in particularly mental health. We are so honored and delighted to have Dr. Bartholomew join us today for his presentation. And please go ahead and provide us any questions that you might have during this. We will address them after the presentation is over. Thank you, John, very much, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Happy to be here, honored to be invited. So will we get the slides up?
Click the little upload slide icon, please.
Gotcha. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So today we're going to talk about our exercise strategies and how we think about exercise at this time from a mental health perspective and where we can see those benefits. And a lot of this comes from 2018, the U.S. Physical Activity Guidelines were presented, and the process for this is exceedingly involved and begins multiple years before this, where a group of national and international scholars on physical activity and all the different domains of physical activity are brought together to be able to review the literature and create consensus statements as to what do we see the benefits for cancer, for cardiovascular disease, for other issues, as well as for mental health. And this was the first year that they had consensus statements broadly on mental health. And then from that literature, they then distill from that the guidelines for the amount of activity that people should be achieving. And so for adults, the U.S. guidelines are a minimum of 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity physical activity. And you can think about this as walking at a brisk pace, walking like maybe you're just a little bit late at the airport and you're trying to hurry but not run. Well, 150 minutes per week, 30 minutes a day for 5 days a week is the minimum recommendations. Obviously, more is better, and the more work that you do, the greater fitness you improve, the greater the benefits for your health. Now, obviously, achieving this can be challenging during times of social isolation, where a number of things have happened. One is I think in general, what's happening are people are doing less strenuous, long workouts that are sort of isolated in their day like they normally did, where maybe you get up and you work out before you go to work, and then you'll go to work for the day, or maybe you'll work out at lunch or afterwards, where you have sort of that defined period where it would sit. And instead, we find people doing multiple bouts of activity throughout the day. We also see individuals when they're not going to work, when they're working at home, there's a much higher rate of sitting and sedentary behavior. And part of the consensus that comes from these guidelines is that there is growing evidence for reducing time spent sedentary, particularly when you're not achieving other workouts. So if you get up and you go for, a 3-mile run in the morning and then have a largely sedentary day, there's probably not a lot of negative health effects from sitting during those periods. But if you don't do those workouts, if you're not getting sufficient activity, then that period of sedentary behavior becomes really problematic. Let me talk to you a little bit about the consensus statement on mental health. First of all, there's quite strong evidence that acute bouts or individual bouts of exercise are sufficient to reduce state anxiety, to reduce a host of negative moods. And that regular participation, more like exercise training, something that you're doing on a daily basis or every other day, and doing longer durations of moderate to vigorous physical activity can reduce trait anxiety and significantly reduces the risk of experiencing depression. And here is a graph of some of the surveillance data in the U.S. with regards to physical activity and mental health. And so the sort of bright orange, light orange bars on the left represent people who are largely sedentary, who are not close to meeting physical activity guidelines, and the darker orange are those individuals that are achieving those guidelines. And roughly it's about a third of the population in each of those pools. And what you find is that for depression, the rates of depression are significantly lower for individuals who are regularly active. The rates of social phobias are significantly lower, of generalized anxiety disorders, of panic attacks. It does not seem to have an impact on alcohol dependence. There's a couple of reasons why that might be. But with regards to general mental health, we quite clearly see, at least a cross-sectional effect, that there are significant reductions across these different forms of poor mental health for individuals that are more active. The question, of course, that comes from that is, which comes first? Is it the physical activity that prevents mental health disorders, or is it the mental health disorders that causes people to become less active? Well, we have consensus. Not as strong a consensus, but there's certainly moderate evidence that depressive symptoms can be reduced by even limited volumes and intensities of physical activity. I think this is one of the things that came from this review that was most surprising, that it's not doing an hour of physical activity that's intense or resistance training. It can be relatively low levels of physical activity are sufficient to to help to manage depressive symptoms. Now, the more that you do, the greater the volume activity that you engage in, the larger the effect on reducing depressive symptoms. And there's actually quite nice work that demonstrates physical activity, regular physical activity, as a treatment of depression to be similar to a number of other treatment modalities. And more you're finding physical activity to be an adjunct to other forms of therapy, particularly talk therapy, what have you, that individuals are utilizing. When we think about physical activity for physical health benefits, the impact on different cancers, the impacts on cardiovascular disease, the impacts on diabetes, it really doesn't matter where you get your physical activity. It can be work-related physical activity. It can be recreational physical activity, and any type of work, any type of recreational activity. It is, there's not a big difference between those. But when we look at it for mental health, it turns out how we feel about the activity impacts how we feel after that activity and the mental health impacts that we derive from that, which is really quite different from what we find with other health-related indicators. So this is a study with postpartum depression. And looking at the types of activity that women engage in after they give birth and how they're related to the risk of depression. And so if you're receiving a reasonably high level of physical activity, but that activity comes from work, then there's a significant increase in risk for postpartum depression. Likewise, if that activity comes from high levels of indoor housework, high levels of adult and child care, so basically for women that have recently given birth and remain the primary caregiver of the rest of the family and manager of the house, then it nearly doubles the risk of postpartum depression. Outdoor household work, primarily gardening and what have you, doesn't seem to have an increase in risk or a reduction in risk, but it's recreational activity. It is the opportunity to go for walks, to walk the dog. It's an opportunity to go for hikes, to do other exercise classes. That form of recreational activity, that is where we see a significant reduced benefit. And again, if we were talking about cardiovascular disease, we wouldn't make these distinctions. These distinctions aren't at all clear. But from a mental health perspective, the type of activity and the meaning that that has for you clearly appears to have an impact on the mental health outcomes that individuals achieve. Now, we know that social isolation leads to acute bouts of activity throughout the day. This is, one of the things we were chatting a little bit before this is that as we move away from traditional work environments to working from the home, for those of us who are fortunate enough to maintain employment, what we find is just a tremendous loss of structure to our day. A couple of months ago, again, people had times that they worked out where they exercised, whether it was before work, lunch, what have you, to be able to fit that in. And then you had a relatively structured day in the office. Well, that's no longer the case. And this has, I think, in many ways expanded the workday for individuals. It even further completely blurs this line between family time and work time, and how do you allocate that time and make those choices. And so many individuals are responding by more brief periods of acute or individual bouts of activity. Now, what's interesting about these is that every time we engage in these, we're able to demonstrate a significant benefit. And so I want to make this distinction between individual bouts of exercise and exercise training. So for exercise training, we're talking about, it could be 3 to 5 days a week where individuals are active and trying to train and make things happen. You get significant increases in fitness, lots of health benefits. But in this case, I'm talking about and there's certain mental health benefits, right? There's less likely to be depressed, less likely to be trait anxious if you're engaged in that training as a long-term benefit. But there are these immediate effects that we see following each bout of activity that we engage in, where we see an improvement in mood. And it's regardless of training status. So individuals who have not been active at all, who have been largely sedentary for the last couple of months or years, if they get up and they go for a walk, they get the same reduction in negative affect. They get the same reduction in state anxiety, as do individuals who have been significantly active and are much fitter. And again, it happens every time. But just like we saw with depression and long-term physical activity, and postpartum depression, we see the same thing with mood, where it depends upon how we feel about the activity. And I want to talk a little bit about a study that I did with Bridget Miller, who's now a professor at Oklahoma State University. And so Bridget worked with recreation sports when she was a graduate student and taught aerobics dance classes. And so we use that population as sort of a ready group of participants and had them perform an aerobics class. And then we measured their negative affect, and I'm showing you the negative affect data here. The blue bars indicate their responses prior to exercise. The red bars indicate their responses 5 minutes, pretty much immediately after the aerobics class was completed. And then the green bars represent 20 minutes after exercise, once they've had an opportunity to recover physically, to catch their breath, to get back closer to baseline physically. How were they feeling? And what we did was we asked the participants, how well did you perform today? What kind of effort did you give? Was it a positive workout? Was it a negative workout? What have you? And they split pretty much in half in those individuals who rate it as a really good workout, as a high performance, as a really positive workout for them, and those who are moderate to negative in their performance, where they don't feel they worked particularly hard, where they weren't happy with their workout, what have you. And again, it's about 50-50. And what you see in terms of negative affect is it doesn't matter whether you had a good workout or a bad workout. There are significant reductions in negative affect for both groups. And in fact, after 20 minutes, if you just look at people's negative affect, you can't tell whether they had a good workout or a bad workout. They look the same. They all have the same reduction in negative affect. This, however, is quite different when we look at positive affect, feelings of energy, feelings of happiness. These are the positive affect data. And again, the high performers are on the left, the moderate to low performers are on the right, and it's the same. Blue is before exercise, and then red is immediately afterwards, and green is following 20 minutes of recovery. And you can see that the individuals who weren't happy with their performance do not get an improvement in positive affect, despite the fact that they see significant reductions in negative affect, reductions in anxiety and perceptions of stress. It's only those who feel as though they have a good workout, that are happy afterwards, that have a sense of energy, a sense of excitement that comes from the workout that they engaged in. This, again, is missing in those individuals with low to moderate levels of performance in terms of how they think about it. So this is really quite interesting to us, right? And it helps us think a little bit about what are the expectations that we have for physical activity with regards to mental health, to make sure that those are appropriate, how we structure those and what those goals are. And so I think quite clearly we recognize that mental health is improved with regular exercise training. Reductions in almost all forms of negative mental health occur for individuals that are more active relative than others. Anything you do is going to be helpful. Any level of activity you engage in is going to be beneficial, but the more that you do, the better. The more we get an increase in fitness, the more we get increases in health, both physical health and mental health. Each time you're active, it reduces stress and anxiety. This is one of the arguments for engaging in this on at least a daily basis, if not, given the structure that our lives are facing right now, multiple times a day. Because every time you're active, you're going to have a reduction in stress and a reduction in anxiety. And I think it's quite clear that individuals are feeling more anxious, that we're experiencing more stress. And so these opportunities for 3 to 5 minutes, even 10 minutes of physical activity spaced throughout the day will help significantly in terms of reducing stress, reducing anxiety. And it really doesn't matter what you do. You can lift weights, you can run, you can walk at a brisk pace, you can swim, you can do stretching activity. Almost any activity you engage in provides a very similar reduction in negative mood. In contrast to that, only movement that you feel good about, where you feel like it's a positive workout, where there's some sense of accomplishment, Those are the ones that help you to feel energized and happy and more positive afterwards. And I would point out the reduction in stress and anxiety is a really positive outcome, right? We don't have to always feel excited after we work out. We don't always have to do this as a way to feel happy. It is really very often sufficient that we have this reduction in negative states as an outcome, and something to feel, that's a real positive that comes from this, even if we don't leave with this sense of excitement and a sense of happiness. And so how do we achieve this during social distancing? First of all, again, anything you do is beneficial. Any type of movement that you engage in is a good thing. There's lots of free workout videos on YouTube or similar platforms that are shared. Pardon me. And one of the interesting things with this and where this can be beneficial is as we seek a sense of accomplishment, these different types of workouts can be really helpful with that. And so very often we see individuals may engage in a spinning class for 6 months, super excited about it. They're doing it all the time. They buy all the shoes, they do everything. They're fully committed to spinning classes. And then after 6 months or a year, it's just time for something different. And they move on and they start boot camps and engage in boot camps for a while and then move on from those to do CrossFit, or they decide to run a 5K, or they decide to swim or triathlon or what have you. And we see people cycling through. And I think one of the benefits of these cycles is that it gives you a new sense of achievement. It gives you something else to accomplish, something else to feel good about, something to feel proud about. And we know, as I've just demonstrated, that when you engage in a workout where you're proud of what you're doing, then you're more likely to receive positive affect from it. You're likely to be happier after that workout than you are otherwise. And so that's one of the things that I think people can really do now is by looking at things that are available on YouTube or other options that present themselves. Can you find something a little bit different, something that gives you a sense of accomplishment, something that mixes things up? I think that can be really beneficial. But by the same token, we can also just do super simple things, walking around the room, walking upstairs. There's a lot of activity that we can do in our apartments, in our houses, that will certainly at a minimum help to reduce perceptions of stress for individuals. Do lots of little activities. Pardon me. Try to reduce the time spent sedentary, the time spent sitting. I'm actually doing a lot of work right now in elementary schools where we're looking at the time that children spend sedentary. And can we interrupt this, right? So very often a fourth grader will have an hour and a half during the day that they spend on mathematics. Well, that's a really long time to sit and focus for someone who's 10 years old. And so we're working on integrating physical activity breaks throughout the school day. And we have very nice data that demonstrates improved attentional focus following that. And as you're working from home, and my guess is you find yourself, because you have that lack of structure, you probably find your mind wandering, you find yourself becoming inefficient. Well, those breaks every 45 minutes, something like that, can certainly help to be a reset for individuals. So, or if you are the kind of social distancer who is spending their time binge watching different shows on Netflix or Hulu or whatever service provider you use, Disney Plus, get up and move during every commercial. Get up and walk in between half-hour shows, things along those lines before you come back to it. Those are breaks that are set into what we're watching, and they're already scheduled for us. Take advantage of those and move during those. And those tend not to give us that much of an accomplishment, right? Walking for 3 minutes during commercials isn't, you're not going to get that many steps, You're going to get a couple of hundred steps through that. But if you do that throughout the day, by the end of the day, you can see yourself reaching an accomplishment where you're hitting 7,000 steps, 8,000 steps. And for somebody that's been largely sedentary, that's a significant increase over what they do. Most individuals, if they're not specifically working out or building a walk into their day, they're probably getting about 2,500 steps a day at most. So building in these small periods of activity, you can see this increase. And a lot of us, if we have smartphones, are already tracking our steps on that. And so use the phone to track it and get some sense of what you're doing and build that sense of accomplishment into your work. And I think you can find that. So So I guess the final thoughts that I would say are the more activity you engage in, the better. Implement it throughout your day, spread it out, find little periods of times to make that go. And then try to do things like tracking it, try to do things like mixing it up and doing different types of activity that can give you a sense of accomplishment so that you're deriving the full mental health benefit from it. And so with that, I will stop and open up for questions.
Thank you very much, John. We have quite a few questions actually coming up. Let me just start by saying that I'm sort of the living example of how exercise and mental health are so intertwined. Is that I suffered from panic disorders, and when I was in my late 30s, early 40s, I suffered from the severe panic attack. And since I started becoming more structured and I engage in a lot more activities like running marathons and being more active on a regular basis. And that really dramatically
We lost your
controlled
microphone,
my
if you
symptoms
can
of
hear us.
anxiety. And now it's a way that I have, when I'm anxious and stressed out, I
I'm gonna try
found that
something
going
really
out
quick.
for a walk or a run really makes a huge difference. So I think I'm a living example of that. And I'm always, and I think that's part of the reason why I pursued my mission with the 5-50-50 as part of my foundation activities to really enforce that. The first question that I have is from someone who is asking me about the reason why, or why is that the regular physical activity does not seem to affect alcohol dependency in your study.
So one of the issues that we tend to find, one of the interesting things about physical activity is there are a lot of subcultures within this. So there are cultures of people who are climbers, for example, and you find people that do a lot of climbing. They have to go out into nature to be able to find places to climb. They tent together, they camp, they go fishing, what have you, and it's sort of this whole broader aspect to this. Likewise, individuals who cycle, they get on and they do cycling trips together where they'll ride out to a time and ride back. Very often they finish those by celebrating with alcohol. And alcohol in some cases becomes a part of the culture surrounding certain physically active groups. And so I think that is one of the things that happens with this in particular. We see this in younger individuals, so individuals in college and maybe in the 10 years after college. We tend to find a high degree of physical activity tied with a reasonable amount of alcohol usage as well within those individuals as just a part of that larger grouping. And so I think that's one of the things that contribute to that. In addition, a lot of individuals will focus on diet as being and smoking as related health behaviors. And so people that are physically active, you might expect to be less likely to smoke, certainly, and to have a healthier diet, but we don't always see that same relationship between physical activity as a way to improve health and lower alcohol use as a way to improve health. And again, it is sometimes in conflict with one another.
I see. One other question I have is about physical exercise and activity and sleep and insomnia. The current environment and the stress really does impact your sleep and sleep habit. And does exercise really help with that?
So I don't know the literature on sleep well. I know there's a relationship between sleep and physical activity, and there are timing issues associated with that, that are related to the intensity of the activity you engage in. And my recollection is that more intense training later in the evening can be disruptive of sleep and time to fall asleep, but earlier in the day, that type of intense physical activity is more associated with positive sleep and deeper sleep.
I see. Another question I have about the exercise number of minutes and type of exercise with older individuals. Does the minutes that you described, the 150 to 300 minutes, and the source of activity apply to everybody across the spectrum, regardless of their age group?
The difference we see is with children. So in children, the recommendation is 60 minutes of physical activity a day, with more high intensity activity mixed into that. What I didn't share with adults is that we also want to see some muscle strengthening activity as a part of this as well. Because one of the things that we find is that, and this is particularly important, so the adult recommendations are the same for older individuals, all adults. We would recommend this in the same fashion. The differences that I would emphasize more with older adults would be some more strengthening activity for them, because it's very often the loss of muscle that leads to frailty and the inability to carry out activities of daily living. I would also emphasize some balance training and flexibility training in older adults as well, given the challenges associated with that. But in terms of the amount of activity a day at that minimum of 150 a week to 300 minutes of physical activity a week, that recommendation holds for older individuals as well. One of the things that I would say, though, is that when we think about moderate intensity, that moderate intensity is going to be dependent upon the individual and their level of fitness. So younger individuals who are more fit will probably walk at a higher intensity to be able to achieve a moderate intensity. Then will less fit individuals, say overweight individuals, older individuals, what have you, then walking, my daughter's cat saying hello. Then it has not been an at-home webinar until you've had an animal walk by or a child cry. They would walk at a slower pace to be able to achieve that same relative intensity.
Yeah. What is the cat's name?
That is Lenny Catfits.
Awesome. All right. We have another question about people who have limited physical activity caused by handicap issues, whether or not they are bound to a wheelchair or they have some other neurologic disorders that really limits their ability to engage in walking, for example, or running. What are the sorts of activity that they can do and still allows them to get the benefit associated with exercise?
So one of the things that you'll see in adapted gyms that are adapted for individuals that are wheelchair bound are arm ergometers. So an ergometer is sort of the cycling motion that you would normally do on a cycle. And so they plant those higher that a wheelchair can access that, and to be able to work on arm ergometers and building arm strength in terms of what people do. And it can be as simple as, and this is very often something that, again, you see with particularly not just individuals with a disability, but with a higher degree of frailty, just doing exercises in terms of lifting cans and doing overhead presses with cans and doing things that are a little bit more body strengthening, a little bit more resistant oriented for those individuals that can be beneficial. The other thing is to think about building physical activity around those activities that we require for daily living. So walking is often recommended because the majority of individuals are able to do that and are required to do that throughout most of their day. And so that makes sense. But you can also do a very nice physical activity program is for individuals that are more limited in what they can do or more frail, is just the get up out of a chair. And so to stand up out of a chair and then sit back down in the chair, and then stand back up out of the chair and sit back down in the chair, as a way to improve strength in a task that individuals need to engage in on a daily basis.
Awesome. Thank you. The other question I have here now is that does indoor or outdoor activities matter? Does it make a difference whether the activity is indoor or outdoor in reference to its impact on your mental health?
So the reduction in negative state, it doesn't matter. You get the same, it is the closest thing in our field to a law. The taking the edge off of wherever you are in terms of, it's not a panacea. It doesn't remove stress. It doesn't remove all negative affect or depressive feelings, but wherever your experience is at that point, it is almost universal that when people engage in some level of activity, indoor, outdoor, whatever it is, that they experience a reduction. The only caveat to that is if you do highly intense activity, that creates negative emotions while you're experiencing it because they're painful and it's challenging. But over time, once you've recovered, you get the same reduction in negative states that you would have otherwise. But it's the positive affect. It's being happy, following a sense of calmness afterwards, a sense of excitement. You are probably more likely to experience that when you're outside, but not from the physical activity, right? You're probably going to experience that because you're outside, because you're in nature, and you're engaging in nature while you're doing that. If your exercise is outside and you have headphones in and you are not paying attention to what's going on and you're watching the trail at your feet with sunglasses on, then chances are that won't provide any real benefit for that. So outdoor activity is likely to have greater improvements in mental health to the extent that you're engaging with nature.
Awesome. Question about whether or not doing the physical activity alone or with a friend or with a group really makes any difference.
So physical activity with somebody else is particularly helpful to get you to actually do it. And there's a social contract that we have there. And it is the side benefits that we derive from physical activity, very much in the way that I just talked about being outdoors, right? Outdoors has an extra benefit to the extent that you're engaging in that. That's not really about the physical activity. That's about being outdoors and engaging with the outdoors. Likewise, anytime we interact with somebody socially, we're going to derive a benefit from that, and likely a mental health benefit from that. And if exercise can help to make that go, then it'll provide a greater benefit than you would have otherwise. But it seems to me that the real benefit from an exercise side is that helps you engage in it because you've set an appointment. We have in our neighborhood, there's a loop that goes around our neighborhood that's about 2.5 miles long, and it's a very popular walking spot. And there's an elementary school on that, and so a number of individuals in the morning will come from other parts of the neighborhood and park there and meet, and then go and walk together. Right? That's an example of where there is this social interaction and social contract that gets them to show up so that they're physically active, and then the activity has that benefit.
Awesome. Question is that since exercise can help fend off the mental health issues like depression or anxiety, people who suffer from depression, should they be exercising more? Should the dose, if we're looking at this as a pill, should the dose that those who have already established mental illness, should they be more active and more engaged and do more than just because this is becoming more of an additional challenge?
So one thing that I would say is that there are a lot of physically active people who still develop depression, still develop anxiety disorders. And so, again, while it is beneficial, it's not beneficial for everybody. Just as certain medications, some people respond to really quite nicely, and other people are more challenged with that and don't derive a benefit. And so that is part of the treatment plan that you work out with your professional. With regards to physical activity, I think I would think about it as more regular physical activity as opposed to just more physical activity. A lot of the benefits that you derive from physical activity with regards to mental health, one is there's a pretty clear regulation of serotonin that occurs with that. But then there is also there's this cognitive benefit of every time you're active, you have a win, right? And for depressed individuals, it so often is associated with clinical anxiety at the same time in a way that undermines your ability to get things done and to move forward, which creates that negative cycle of self-reproach. And the way that I talk about it to my classes is every day you're physically active, you have a win. right? It doesn't matter what you do the rest of the day. You've done something good for yourself. You've done something that's positive. And so I would think about more consistent physical activity and more regular physical activity as probably being key over doing really intense physical activity. Because one of the challenges that's interesting about all of this is once we start moving to higher levels of intensity, we also start shifting our comparison group and what we think of as successful and unsuccessful. And you can start to run and actually create some challenges because now you need faster times. And it's not enough to just run a 5K. Now I need to PR every time I do a 5K, right? And I need to beat somebody else, or I need to place. I need to move to 10Ks because a 5K really isn't that much. That's just for beginners. And you run it, and all of these other thoughts start to interfere with what's going on. And so I think it's and individuals that are depressed, individuals with anxiety disorder tend to that type of thinking. And so I want to be careful about recommending exercise that's overly intense because it gets caught up in these other ideas as opposed to more regular activity.
Got it. Someone who have depression and just doesn't want to exercise, how do you motivate them?
Yeah, that's somebody without depression and doesn't want to exercise. How do we motivate them? Is as much a question as anything else that we do. So I think the answer is the same for everybody, whether you're depressed or you're not depressed. If you're having a difficult time exercising, what are some of the things that you think about? So I think there's a couple of things that I would encourage you to consider. One is, if you think about the benefits of physical activity, the vast majority of the benefits of physical activity accrue over time. And so they are backloaded, right? The improvement in health, the improvement in fitness, the improvement in mental health, these all take time to be able to achieve. All the cost of physical activity are experienced early. The soreness that you have, the pain that you have. Most individuals, when they begin an exercise program, they start to eat more, and as a result of that, actually gain weight in the first couple of weeks that they're engaging in physical activity before they lose weight. The cost associated with it is highest. So all of the pain points are front loaded. And as a result of that, the experience that people have when they begin an exercise program is usually negative if they've been sedentary. And the problem is all the recommendations have come from people who are highly active and do this all the time and forget about all of that pain and suffering.
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, it naturally causes some self-questioning of the individual. And is this just me? And is exercise really something that I should be pursuing? And so that's one of the things that creates problems. And so how do we front load some more positive experiences? So the idea of engaging in it outside, lower intensity of activity that's less painful, as well as interacting with friends while you're doing it. What add-on benefits can we do to help to motivate people? The second thing is, how do we reduce the number of decisions that people need to make to be physically active? Because each decision point is an opportunity to stop. So an example of this is when we used to go to work all the time, we would have a time in the morning when we would have to leave to go to work, say 8 o'clock. Then I need to set my alarm early enough to be able to get out of bed, to be able to take care of, basic needs in the morning, maybe get a cup of coffee before I get out and go for a run, right? So each one of those is a decision. I have to set my alarm. I have to actually get out of bed when my alarm goes off, because I don't have to get out of bed because I still have 2 hours before I need to go to work, but I need to do it early enough to make that happen. I need to put my workout clothes on. I need to not open my computer and start checking my email, because then I'll get sucked into my email and that'll eat away time. And at some point it'll get too late that I can't go on my run and still get back to be able to leave and go to work on time, right? And so there are a host of decisions that happen. And how do we reduce those decisions so that people can follow through on their intentions? Because the reality is, we don't have a lot of trouble getting people to try. What I was trying to get to was just sort of the idea of, how do you reduce the number of decisions. So lay your clothes out the night before, so that you just get out, you put them on right away, and you don't have to find them. How do we reduce those number of decisions, reduce any barriers that you might have to act on that? Because people engage in activity all the time, right? And this is sort of, I think, what I was saying when you lost me was people try exercise every January 1st. They try it in the spring when they start shopping for bathing suits. They try it whenever the weather's nice. They try physical activity multiple times. We don't have trouble getting people to try. It's getting people to maintain that is the real challenge that we're faced with.
Cool. A question. What do you think, John, about the impact of rewards? Should one be using rewards as a way to entice them or to motivate them to exercise?
Yeah. So, it's so if you think about marathons, would anybody run 26 miles just to get a T-shirt? Most people would say no to that. But if you don't give them a T-shirt, nobody signs up for your marathon. So there is a concept called insufficient justification. And insufficient justification happens when you have a reward that is small but critical to get you to try something, but upon reflection isn't sufficient for you to do it. So you must have done it because you really wanted to do it. Right. And to try to create that sense within the individual. And cool T-shirts are an example of that with marathons. It's not enough to train for and run a marathon to get a T-shirt, but at the end of the day, the T-shirt was really important in getting me to go. I just don't admit that to myself. So some level of reward is beneficial, especially early on, when people are experiencing more of the negative aspects, more of the pain associated with physical activity. And that reward may just be calling them out, having something positive. And like, if you think about Peloton and classes like Peloton, it is, hey, John in Texas, good to see you here today, right? That's a reward. So it can just be an acknowledgement or something like that. Those types of small rewards are really quite powerful. Likewise, rewards that provide a sense of mastery or a sense of accomplishment can be really beneficial as well. So if you are surprised by a reward because you did so well at something, or you stayed so many times and we just wanted to say how proud we are of what you've done, like that's a reward, and here's a shirt, here's a parking space that you get to use for a week, whatever it is, right? A special place in class. Those things can be really quite powerful without undermining your motivation. It's when the rewards become so great that the reason you exercise is because you're getting a reduction in your insurance, and that is a huge reward for an individual, then that's the only reason you're doing it. And if that reward's taken away, then you stop being active. And so it's the smaller rewards that are beneficial, particularly as we try to get people through early experiences.
The one thing that I'm sure you agree with me, John, is that you don't want to use food as a reward.
No, you don't want to use food as a reward. You would want to avoid that, or alcohol. As some groups do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, another question about yoga, whether or not yoga can do the same thing. If you can't really, because of arthritis or other joint challenges or muscle issues, how about yoga?
So yoga, Tai Chi would be another example of a low intensity form of movement balance training in individuals like yoga. That is, both of those are well studied, and both of those provide clear mental health benefits to individuals. You don't get the exact same physical health benefits that are based on sort of aerobic fitness changes, but you get a lot of the mental health benefits from that, as long as you can do the poses. I am challenged with I find yoga sometimes more frustrating than I do peaceful, but again, that is early in the process where we tend to have this more negative experience. But yeah, very much so.
Yeah, awesome. The question about ethnicity, different ethnic backgrounds, whether or not there is any, whether you're Hispanic or Caucasian or Black, or whether or not the ethnicity has any impact or would have any differentiation in respect to overall the amount of exercise or the benefit of exercise.
I think I don't know of any research that shows different amounts of physical activity required to receive the same benefits. So from that perspective, I don't believe that's the case. But my guess is there are clear, and there's actually some examples of clear cultural differences in what activities you feel good about and what meaning you overlay on activities. So, for example, there's a research group in Austin that was studying physical activity in low income areas down on the border in South Texas. And the women that were physically active, their friends were giving them a hard time because they're like, "What are you, rich? Did you get it made that you don't need to, that you can be out exercising, that you don't have so much to do in your house to prepare for your family? And, don't you love your family anymore that you're exercising?" Right? Well, that's a very clear cultural challenge in certain groups to be able to manage, and it gets to this idea of what is the larger meaning that we place on exercise and physical activity for an individual that gets to this point of when do we feel proud about the work that we're doing, and how do we overcome that? And I've actually become really interested in these types of issues, and I've actually thought about it as well with regards to, if you're in a couple and one person becomes active and the other doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
that's almost like a mini cultural challenge within that pair. And where the individual who isn't active very often works purposely to undermine the activity of the other person, right? And creates real tension within the relationship. And so that happens on a mini scale within a family or within a couple, but it quite clearly happens, I think, on these broader cultural ethnic groups, on how do they define it and how do they think about this, and what is the broader meaning that physical activity has for those groups.
Clear. Clearly that there are barriers to exercise, and the pandemic and the situation that we're in has added to the barrier. But clearly, from listening to you and hear about the activity levels that we can still do, that really that pandemic and the challenges that we have with that should not really stop us from being able to engage, continue to be active, whether indoor or outdoor, and get the benefit of exercise. So, in a nutshell, it is possible to continue to do this. Uh, from someone who exercises regularly, you know, does it really matter aerobic, non-aerobic, weight training, not weight training, and its overall impact?
From a mental health perspective, resistance exercise has been shown to be very similar in terms of the benefits that we see for mental health. And in fact, some of the data, there's not enough studies to really conclude this, but some of the data indicate that resistance exercise and weight training is stronger than aerobic exercise for depression. I wonder whether or not that's because there's a greater sense of accomplishment often with weight training, because the numbers are more salient. There's real meaning in weight training in terms of being able to lift 100 pounds or 50 pounds or whatever it is. I also tend to think that improvements in strength, especially as we get older, have a huge impact on your daily life, just in terms of being able to carry groceries in, and just do the laundry and lift baskets and what have you. And so that strength becomes really important. So that may be why there is some evidence for that being beneficial. But I agree with you. I think it's harder to work out. It can be harder to work out as hard as we used to if we don't have a place where we can run and feel comfortable running without a lot of people there. If we don't have room in our house to be doing the kinds of workouts we did beforehand, I think it can be quite difficult to do the types of activity you engaged in beforehand and to do it at the intensity that you used to do it. But there are any number of types of physical activity that you can engage in that you can make that happen, particularly when we think about it from a mental health perspective. You can certainly do enough activity to be able to maintain and improve mental health from your home. That I think is quite clear.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. And we're approaching the end of the session. I just want to let all of our audience that this session will be available. It is being recorded, and it will be available on our website, on our Facebook, as well as on YouTube. So one last comment I'd like to make is that I hope that what we have been able to do to all of you today to continue to enforce the fact that physical activity, despite the constraints associated with this pandemic, is still possible. The benefits from it, as clearly explained by Dr. Bartholomew, can still be gained and can still be achieved. So we hope that this presentation has given you the ammunition to go ahead and move forward and remain engaged and continue to participate, because ultimately you're a winner. Every day you do this, I'm going to repeat what you just said, John, you are a winner. So you're winners by actually listening to us and participating in our event. You're winners because you are going to follow through, because ultimately you and the whole society will benefit. So thank you so much for participating, and thank you, Dr. Bartholomew, for being part of our first part of these webinars. This has been incredibly helpful, and I thank you so much, and you all have a great day, and have a wonderful additional seminars coming up soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Dr. Bartholomew.
It's been my pleasure.